Uh, Thank you, Chair. I'd also like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Uh, I, I'm going to speak slightly differently. If you notice, I have changed the heading of my topic from weaponization to militarization of space, primarily because it's my considered view that militarization is a concept that is some time away. It's going to be an incremental process, and therefore we have to understand the full extent of militarization before we start delving into the weaponization part. The second logic is the weaponization is also linked to the proliferation, nuclear proliferation efforts. So we may not talk about these things, but the essential aspect is that these are absolutely linked. So therefore, I will be focusing on my talk on two essential topics. One, I'll be discussing the militarization versus weaponization, and second part of that will be what does the weaponization mean, and lastly I will have a couple of slides on to the where India's space program is going to go and in up to 2025. We are all aware of the fact that the technological advances have led to the integration of outer space capacities into terrestrial warfare, and today space forms an integral part of our warfighting doctrine. And therefore, the nature of warfare as we are looking at today is signaling space as a new domain for competition and leveraging superiority. So therefore, essentially speaking, space is going to be that subset of the new domain of warfighting which is going to be essential in all aspects of our terrestrial warfare. So this is something we need to recognize. And this has got a far-reaching military, economic, political ramifications, and in fact is at the backdrop of an entire military transformation effort that we are trying to get at. But sadly, in countries like us, this issue is only incrementally factored, is not factored in totality. We are still looking in conceptual terms on fighting terrestrial warfare based on terrestrial-based sensors and not space-based sensors, because of this fact that we have sort of lagged behind in our developmental effort in this particular field. But look at what is happening in the world. There is a US Space Vision 2020 that has attempted to develop what is called a space-based interceptor test bed as part of the entire national missile defense. And the Chinese are moving, as has been very well articulated by the previous speaker, are moving far ahead in the field of developing space capabilities. In fact, like him, I like to also focus on what the Chinese are up to. The recent, the March ballistic missile defense test of an in-flight missile really indicates to us as to what else is happening, particularly in this field, and that we need to take cognizance of. And this is an arena that is going to go up as the technology improves. And this is, from Indian perspective, is an important development because it's happening in our neighborhood. This is something which we need to take cognizance of. So the question comes is, why is space a new frontier? Firstly, we are developing capabilities to dominate. The fundamental is that we have to develop capacities and capability to dominate our adversary. Where are we? Where are the chances? Where are these capacities and capabilities available? The Chinese have come out with what they call an anti-access or an area denial concept. What is the loci standi of an anti-access threat? The anti-access basically is to prevent the opponent for deploying forces capable of destroying you, and you create such heavy damage on him that he is deterred for such deployments. Now, the fundamentals of an ASAT is a hugely integrated C4ISR system. What is this system based on? This system is essentially based on space-based assets. So until unless you create those space-based assets and you have a direct integrated linkages into networks, you cannot have this kind of capacities. Right now there is a perceptional thinking in dealing with a Chinese threat, for example, I am not giving any secrets, is that Chinese can build up huge amount of military forces into Tibet. The question that comes about is, don't we know that they will be able to build it up? And if he can build up those capacities, we need to enhance our ISR cover. If you are dealing with the Pakistani strategic threat, you have no option but to have a 24/7 ISR cover over Pakistan, day, night, every type of weather conditions. Primarily because that's the only way you will get to know it's shifting in his postures. So the question that basically comes is that the space dominance is going to be a new arena of warfare. We have already seen a fairly large scale militarization of space. We see space support, that is the launching and managing of orbit satellites. Space force enhancement includes all kinds of space operations to enhance terrestrial military operations. We see space control. Access and denial of space is going to be the new arena. And then, of course, the last will be the Space Force application. We will talk about these things a little later. So therefore, from the militarization construct, which is current phase that we are in, we would be moving into the weaponization phase, but that's going to be an incremental process, like I said. So this brings me to the debate of militarization versus weaponization. What is militarization of space? We use this term, I just thought I'll take a second to clarify it, is utilizing space to support military operations. So all actions that we take in space which enhance us military operations is termed as militarization of space. So whether we have early warning communication satellites, we have command and control, PNT systems, monitoring, all kinds of national technical means that are deployed are part of the militarization effort. What is the aim? Aim is to enhance communication, strategic and battlefield surveillance, and above all, precision strikes. Precision strike is a new arena of warfare which we need to think of. Conceptually, today, if you have a nuclear neighbor, you really do not have to launch nuclear weapons on him to destroy his nuclear capacities. If you can take out his nuclear weapons in a deployed format through precision strikes. So there is this changing whole ball game in technological fields that is taking place, and that's something which you need to take cognizance of. And why has militarization of space taken place? Because of the lacuna, or let's put it this way, an opening in the Outer Space Treaty which allows peaceful exploitation of space for peaceful purposes, which is seen as a non-aggressive act. Even today, what does this Outer Space Treaty prohibits you? It prohibits you from deploying weapons of mass destruction in space. It does not prohibit you from doing non-nuclear deployments in space. And this is the reason why you have things like the rods from space programs, that is using huge tungsten rods fired from space for destroying deeply penetrated weapon systems or deeply penetrated assets. This is also the reason what has created the whole ball game of ASAT testings as well as the ballistic missile defense. Fundamentally, what we've seen up to date today is, despite this ASAT test, the countries have not used space targeting as a concept. Space assets have not been targeted so far, but like I've said in the slide, this is primarily because everybody dependent on C4ISR, the synthetic aperture radar satellites, optical reconnaissance, all kinds of navigational, optical, ELINT, and etc. systems. But there is a shift. Try and look at what is the air-sea concept is of the Americans to deal with the so-called anti-excess strategy. The air-sea concept essentially means is degrading his systems so that he cannot launch the kind of attacks that he's planning to launch on the American forces building up in the Pacific. If you look at what is the ASAT, ASAT is finally an integration of three systems: over the horizon radar, the oceanic satellites, as well as the ELINT satellites. So if you can bring in a rupture in this chain, you are degrading his capability. So how do you bring a rupture in this chain is going to be an issue that is going to take you to the next phase of space exploitation for military purposes, that is weaponization. Statistically, we have seen how the space has been used during Operation Enduring Freedom. So many thousands of guided munitions, 100,000 precision lightweight GPS receivers. And closer home, like I mentioned, the edifice of the Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile is based on SAR, reconnaissance and ocean surveillance satellites as a part of an architecture to facilitate ASBM mid-course and terminal guidance. Most important, mid-course and terminal guidance is the hallmark of the entire ASBM system, primarily because it is going to hit a moving target. So this is where the whole aspect is going to come into, and this, because of these developments, the perception is that we would end up in weaponization. ASBM is seen as a major game changer. Then there will have to be an antidote for that system that is developed. The second issue, which is also becomes important, is that Chinese nuclear thinking, for example, is shifting from what do they call NFU. They have what we call a no first use doctrine. But that new first use doctrine is being laced by two adjectives. One is ineffective first strike and an effective NFU. To create an effective NFU and an ineffective first strike, you have to deal with the oncoming missile systems. And that is providing the Chinese the credibility of developing both the assets as well as capacity to kill the incoming missiles. Apart from the fact, the second part of his, the effective NFU is also means survival. And the survival is to ensure that the degradation cost to their missiles which are in silos and within the deeply dug tunnels in the mountains, those survive the first strike. So therefore, it is not just like that these kind of technological developments are taking place. They are a part of a deep-seated conceptual thinking that is emerging as a part of what the technological developments are taking place in one part, and therefore as an antidote to dealing with those systems. ASAT and BMD, as I said, was at the forefront of thinking on the deployment of space-based weapons, and this is for the following reasons. The idea is defending satellites and ensuring freedom of action to operate in space, i.e., if there is a standoff in the Pacific, just as an example, were to take place, and the Chinese are going to launch a long-range cruise missile HN-21 or a DF-21D, the anti-ASAT weapon, then there has to be an antidote. There has to be a degradation of his systems. So therefore, if the air-sea concept has to succeed, then the Chinese space-based assets have to be degraded. So if those have to be degraded, you have to find systems to degrade them. Secondly, basically a fallout of that is to denying adversary ability to use space assets. And thirdly is intercepting ballistic missiles using space-based interceptors. This is an important point, particularly the fact is that now the Chinese believe one of the reasons Chinese have been at the forefront of criticizing America for deploying BMD, but now they are doing it themselves. Logic, because America is deploying 18 set batteries of ballistic missile defense in the Pacific, so we need to guard against that, because and this is a case of what we call as strategic stability. In terms of strategic stability, the Chinese believe now that they have to have an antidote to deal with it. Now I'll come to two subsets of weaponization of space, what is called the space control and the space force application. Space control essentially is denial of space and involves protecting on-orbit assets and those of friendly countries attacking enemy assets and denying access to space. Basically, it's a defensive concept. The primary means of achieving is to either launch suppression or destroying or degrading the performance of enemy satellites, and these actions can be both defensive or offensive. You can degrade it directly, or you can ensure that the enemy opponent satellites are not operating optimally. Fundamental perspective approach is technical feasibility and cost effectiveness. That's the important part, because we cannot have any system developed which is too exorbitantly costly or technically not feasible. In terms of space force application, this envisages attacking terrestrial targets from space-based weapons, which would greatly reduce problems of attacking strategic targets deep inside enemy territory. Now, if we have to destroy, or one opponent has to destroy targets deep inside other countries' targeting, for example, his command and control systems, say talking about decapitation strikes, not in terms of using non-nuclear weapons, then these kind of systems would provide that kind of, in a sense, in a very peculiar sense, weaponization of space may make nuclear proliferation passe. Nuclear proliferation may suffer. The countries with nuclear weapons may lose the advantage of using nuclear weapons if there is a credible weaponization of space. But again, here, the proliferation part of that will become an important issue. This is not something which I am talking about loosely. The fact of the matter is that it is something is in a direction that we could be looking at in the future. This is not today, not in 2013, not in 2020, perhaps something which we should be looking around in 2030s and around that period. Of course, the perception is that country which goes in for weaponization is trying to gain hegemony in space. And if you read the discourse which is currently on between the Russians and the Chinese, Russians and the Americans on the weaponization of space, you will get a clear picture how seriously are the Russians looking at this whole issue. Russians look at this whole issue of weaponization of space as an act of war, and they have to deal with it. So if this whole process of weaponization was to go through, then there would perhaps be a huger amount of conflict, as we have seen in terms of deployment of ballistic missile defense in erstwhile former Soviet Union countries and Eastern Europe. Russians, for example, have categorically said deployment in Ukraine is not acceptable. So we are looking at two aspects. One is there is a move towards weaponization. Countries are looking at weaponization as a new high ground, new horizon. A, B, it could impact the whole aspect of proliferation of nuclear weapons. And third is, it in itself is a conflictual issue because the countries who are going to suffer, that is, if the Americans were to move faster in this phase, then the Chinese and Russians would do it, and so perhaps India would also try to catch up. So this is the kind of scenario that we are looking at in terms of, in conceptual terms on weaponization of space. I will not worry about this, but I come to India Space Vision 2025. India apparently has developed, based on open source inputs, developed a fairly credible space vision, which is called Space Vision 2025, which aims at shifting the onus of ISR from ground-based sensor to space-based sensor in an incremental fashion, and acknowledges the exploitation of space as an imperative for Indian future force development strategy. So this is the backdrop. So what are the elements of this? The first element is the status quo scenario. Essentially, basically means is how India develops its space capabilities in an environment of managed asymmetry, but basically being in work in progress. The second scenario is deteriorating regional situation, which is perceived to come about by about 2025, in which essentially relates to the emerging threat from China. In this case, what should India do to dominate its space and leverage space as a part of a war-fighting doctrine? And the third is regional aspiration, primarily focused on providing full maritime domain awareness using space-based assets, including OTH, over the horizon radars, by about 2025, 2030, over the IOR. So the whole idea is to develop capacities and capabilities for space asset domination in specific areas in specific times. The phase one of this plan relates to creating a specific area and time capability for space asset domination in areas which are of our current interest, essentially speaking, China and Pakistan, as far as the land and the continental domain is concerned. This includes launching of air satellites to cover regional areas, allow C4ISR and data fusion, some of the elements which the previous speaker talked about, software packages to disseminate imagery data in near real times, and deployment of INSS and Gagan and things like that. The phase two relates to development of sectoral capabilities, again real or near real-time picture, allowing real-time ISR, precision engagements, post-strike damage assessments over designated areas, including IORs, certain areas of IOR, designated areas of IOR, and these include near real-time inputs, capability to place minimum number of satellites during the warning period to cover specific areas, upgradation of electronic warfare and ELINT capabilities, provide near real-time surveillance on demand, creation of satellite redundancy, data fusion, and development of space domination assets. And the third phase can be termed as development and deployment of space efforts to cover the entire IOR. This entails developing space asset dominance of complete area to provide a real-time picture and credibly enhance airspace management through data fusion and ability to exploit space assets. And this will provide enhance the existing battle base of satellite coverage to provide real-time information, improve CEPs, sub-meter resolution on demand of specific areas, and chain of skywave and surface wave OTH radars linked with satellites to enhance maritime domain awareness. What is the Indian perspective of weaponization? Essentially, for many in our country, militarization and weaponization are seen as synonymous. And this sort of reflects the current Indian state. However, both our political leaders and of course the military are acutely aware of the need for weaponization. In fact, at the 50th anniversary of the Indian Air Force, President Pranab Mukherjee, when he was the defense minister, he said, there is a merit in asking for creation of separate institutions to oversee the assets that take warfare into space. However, as part of our overall thinking, he laced his remark by saying that India will not go back on international commitments and weaponized space-based assets. So he said two things at the same time. He said we recognize the fact we need to do it, but we will not be the outliers to the treaty. But it's important to note that there are some programs which are working on space weaponization. There is a program called Kali, called the Kinetic Attack Loitering Interceptor. There is a program called Durga, called the Directionally Unrestricted Ray Gun Array, and Proto Laser Weapon Technology, among others, which signify this thing. As has been brought out earlier, we are thinking at least of doing technology demonstration of our ASAT capabilities. So, in the final analysis, ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to conclude by saying is that US and Chinese space policy and plans have started an action-reaction cycle. It is a process that is leading to weaponization of space. The important point to note is, intrinsically, the mankind has never been satisfied with status quo. The fear of military and economic domination by one has driven nations to compete aggressively for primacy in the ultimate high ground, and in this case, the space. The question is impact of warfare and repercussions. Can we obviate the space race? Thank you for your attention.